The 610 story? Probably down in the bottom of that newspaper article box over there. When the paper, read that they were going to scrap it. I thought, well, gee, I'll just ask for it and see what happens. So I went down to the stock show, and Watt looked at me and said, when you hook onto that and move it out of here, well, then we'll give you the deed to it. And found out I had a lot of friends. A guy, even Ray Miller, a friend of mine that ran the heavy equipment, said, and I'll run the machinery if you can get it. And Joe Stark said, if Ray Miller will give up his vacation to run the machinery, you can have everything we got on the yard to move it with. So we started that, moved the bulldozer down there, and actually went up to the front on one of the pilots with the loader to see if it was frozen to the ground, to the track, and it wasn't, it moved. So the T&P loaned us track panels. We need to build 1,000 feet of track. Neiman Brothers Trucking hauled all the equipment. Lots of people put out a lot of effort for 2 weeks and got it ready to move. And then from that point in time on, it was just a matter of waiting for the railroad legalities to clear and move it from where it was at Will Rogers Memorial Coliseum out to the Federal Reserve Center, where it sat until I read about the Freedom Train. So I wrote a letter to Ross, and he wrote back a letter saying that if the engine were fixed to specifications, that it could power the Freedom Train in Texas. So that began the start of it.
Well, Dave's father was involved with the railroad and loved to go by and see the engine in the park. And when he found out that the city was going to close off the track and it would be locked in forever, why the city put it up for sale or offered it to anybody. And David called me one day and wanted to know if I'd help if he could get it, which I told him I would. And darned if he didn't get the thing. Well, what happened as we were moving it that first day, we just barely cleared University Drive. We were pulling down, and I looked out and saw Eamon Carter, an influential gentleman from Fort Worth that I had met earlier, and he'd come over to look at the engine, and I introduced him to Dave, and Eamon made the biggest mistake of his life because he said, now, if you need any help on this, why, let me know. And he said he regretted that many times. Really, he didn't. He loved it. But he'd become involved, by the way, Eamon Carter, during World War II. He was a prisoner of war over there in Germany. And he had helped sabotage some of their trains. The workmen along the track, when the freight train was coming along, if it was going slow, they'd raise the lids and throw some dirt in the journal boxes to help, hoping to make a hot box for the German trains. But he loved trains anyway. And of course, he grew up in Fort Worth, which was the railroad center of Texas. And so he lived up to his word, and when we needed some help, he would run things in his newspaper. And he became influential in raising the money to restore the engine for the Freedom Train. He was really our savior on that. So he wanted to know if he could have a meeting with all the participants, which he did. And so he came down, and we had a meeting at the Fort Worth Club. And we'd all sort of discussed, that why should we try to figure out how to raise money for our engine for his train. And he came up with this great movie that he'd brought down of his the train he ran in 1969 for the connecting of the rails. And when he did that, why, he showed this thing, and every time they made a stop in some town, the high school band was out there, and 1,000 people gathered around the train and cheered, and so right then, Eamon Carter jumped up and said, I think I'll just start off by donating $25,000, started off. So that's where we got our start. And then he knew all the other folks with the foundations that were there, and he'd twist their arm, so we raised the money, and here we are.
Well, we had about a year and a half, and the Santa Fe pulled the engine out of the Federal Center over to the north side, which was a location that we could get outside. No shed, no building, no nothing.
It was sort of like pictures of working on the pyramids, you know. We had hand-powered jacks, and we did everything with blocks and hand jacks, no cranes. And when you look back at it, the only people who would do that are people that work for nothing. So you couldn't hire anybody to work that hard. Because, you know, I look back on some of the things we did, and we were probably crazy, you know. And the paint job came out looking good. And everything just kind of worked together, just helter-skelter. Of course, we'd have tourists come down, and the closer we got to finishing, the more people would show up. And sometimes Sundays it was like a carnival out there, you know, all the people out taking pictures, which was good because it showed interest. And when we finally got the thing done and had the thing all painted up, we were running it back and forth down the track, and it looked like $1 million. Well, it was supposed to start in El Paso. We were supposed to have had it ready and meet the Freedom Train in El Paso and then carry it to all the stops in Texas. But we were behind, and one reason because of the grease problem. We were a little bit late, so we couldn't make it until San Antone, but they were ready to come back time we got there. And so we hooked up in Austin and had a big ceremony down there with the two engines parked side by side. And then we pulled it from Austin to Houston, and then up to Fort Worth, and then Dallas, and then back to Fort Worth. And then the 4449 hooked up there in that bright and early one morning and took it to Wichita Falls.
It was an uncertain future because it only went 1,200 miles in Texas. That was sort of a shame that to do all that work and it not be used. So I called Jim Baseline with the Southern and wrote him a letter and offered the engine to him and all the spare parts, everything else, if they'd go ahead and run the timeout on it, which they did. I think a lot of people saw it and enjoyed the rest of the time it had. In 1982, a friend of mine called me and asked me if I had heard that Amon had died, and I told him no, I hadn't. And Amon Carter was the only influential person that was actually in back of this in Fort Worth. So with his passing, I was powerless to do anything with it, and we did have a certain amount of money in the bank and took that and gave it to the state along with the engine, which dismantled its building it was in, and that's where it is now in Palestine, Texas, with the Texas State Railroad. I would have liked to have seen it do more with the Freedom Train. However, it did what it was supposed to do in the time period that it was. And I want to thank those that were connected with the Freedom Train that saw to it that it got good care while they had it. It is amazing that it got done now that I look at it, with the tank blocked up on blocks outside, no cranes. I'm amazed that with the effort of all these people, the older retired T&P people, machinists, mechanics, and pipe fitters that were still around, their help was unbelievable. But it did get done. I think a lot of people thought that it wouldn't, but it did. You know, I did what I did, and now I look back on that, I'm not as naive as I was, but I had a good time with it. And surely there's somebody else that has persistence and determination. I think someday it will run again.
So I got a free ride to Wichita Falls on the Freedom Train when it left Fort Worth, and a pin. But I had a hell of a lot of fun.